Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the fickle mistress, and I'd like to start with a fundamental conflict that we all have in our lives, where we want change, but we don't want change at the same time. What does this mean? It means that, even as children, we want to move away and explore the world, but at the same time, we want to stay close to our mothers. Similarly, in life, we want to move out and explore the world, but at the same time, we want the security of staying at home and staying anchored with things that are very familiar to us. So this is a conflict that is there even at the heart of relationships. So with our relationships as well, we find that we want our partners to be, changing and not the same as they were before. But at the same time, if once they change, we find it difficult to accept. Now, there are many relationships that are similar to relationships with brands, but particularly loyal relationships. For instance, with brands, we may be in different types of relationships. We may be passionate devotees of some brands. We may be in a settled spouse-like relationship with others. We may have a master-servant relationship with some others and illicit license with other brands. But just because we are in stable relationships doesn't mean that we don't feel the inclination to flirt. So every time you go to a supermarket, you would flirt with other brands. You'd say, oh, that's a handsome brand of milk. Or, that's a pretty little, soft drink, new soft drink. So this inclination to flirt is all around us. So in order to understand this whole concept of loyalty and change and flirtation, we ran a very small limited experiment where we circulated a list of 25 categories amongst 14 professionals in their 20s, the millennials, and said, we asked them two questions. The first question was a simple one. Do you have brands that you are loyal to? The second question was a little more complex. We said, how long do you want your brand that you are loyal to stay the same before you can allow it to change? And we found a surprising range of answers. The range was from never for a few categories to a few months to very frequent change. So if we mapped the categories in which people wanted change and didn't want change, we found that in categories like soap, skincare, staple foods, people did not want any change whatsoever. But there are categories where people wanted change constantly. So therefore, from some categories, consumers are looking for stability as anchors. And there are other categories from which they seek change. So there are therefore two categories. There are anchor categories and there are change categories. Anchor categories are those which give us a sense of stability, which give us the sense of centrality in our dynamic world. So consumers feel an ownership and control over the brands which are in their anchor categories. Anchor categories are personalized, they're ritualized, and they are very central to our existence. Anchor categories are those that we grow old with, in which we don't want any sort of change, and any change is disruptive or disturbing. A good example of how people reacted to change in an anchor category was the launch of New Coke in 1985, where they tried to change the formulation of Coke, and there was such a big pushback to this change that they had to change back to their original formulation. Now there are other categories where people seem to want change. These are categories which drive change and upgradation in people's lives. Generally, these categories are technology-based, they are externally driven, they have a lot of social significance, they have flaunt potential. And these are categories where people want almost constant change. For instance, cell phones. People want to see a change in the cell phones almost on a continuous basis. But just because you have a change category doesn't mean that everything in that category can change. Now, you may assume that fashion accessories and fashion garments are a category which would constitute a change category. But when Gap changed their logo to this is what people thought of the logo. And they faced such a strong pushback against this logo that they said that if this logo is brought into the clothing store, I'm not going to be shopping with Gap. This is a very unreasonable and illogical kind of response. But the next comments were even more interesting. They said that it's not the logo that's the problem with Gap. It's the clothing. I want change in the clothing. I want you to refresh the designs. I don't want you to change the logo. Which brings us to an interesting point. which is that in each brand, there are constancy elements and there are change elements. In anchor categories, the constancy elements in the brand are far larger than the number of change elements in the brand. Whereas in change categories, the constancy elements are much smaller and the change elements are much larger. That doesn't mean there are no constancy elements. There are, but they are much fewer, and you have to figure out what they are. Constancy elements are the elements that your consumer owns, whereas the change elements are elements that you own. So if you want to change something which constitute the constancy elements, you have to take permission of your consumer. And if you don't do that, then there will be a strong pushback. A classic is something where the constancy elements totally eclipse the change elements. So it becomes a very static and it becomes petrified as a brand, and you can do nothing further with it. You can only move on. So now these are concepts of change and constancy on a macro basis. But the conflict really comes to the forefront when the brand that you're loyal to actually changes in front of your eyes, and that is the moment of change. Now, we found that there are 3 stages of response of loyal consumers to the moment of change. The first stage is an interesting one, which says, you are not the one I married. Now, regardless of the change, the first response is discomfort and rejection. You're not sure that the kind of change that's happened is good for you or bad for you, but there's an outright rejection of that change. A good example of this is when Gmail first changed their design. They faced a huge amount of pushback from Gmail loyal users who had started with the brand. And this is the kind of thing that they said. They said, as an appreciative nod to those who got Gmail off the ground as evangelists, give us what we signed up for. They did not even know whether the change that was going to take place was a positive change or a negative change. They just did not want change. Now, what happens after you get over this initial feeling of upset when something has changed? The next thing you do is wonder whether you should stick or twist. Should you stay or should you go? So there are conflicted emotions at this stage, and people figure out whether they like or dislike the change. Now, for a lot of loyal consumers, the stronger inclination is to adapt rather than break up, because they have invested a lot in the relationship with the brand, just like in relationships with our partners in real life. So in an evaluative mode, people may thereafter assess the change more rationally. And then they may decide to stay on or move out. But then every change has the impact of weakening the bond, because the original terms of engagement between the two have kind of broken a little bit. So there is a very important need for dialoguing with the consumer in this particular phase. Now, coming back to the example of Gap, when they faced the pushback, Gap listened. So, in here they say, we've heard loud and clear that you don't like the new logo, so we're bringing back your old logo. So because of this, the consumer's voice was heard and the consumer's sense of ownership was validated. So Gap did that, and in fact, it might have strengthened the bond between Gap and its consumers because they listened. Now, if your change is in the no-go, no-change zone, it's in one of the areas which are not negotiable, then the consumer has no option but to twist, to move away and find a new brand on the rebound. But just because they have moved away from the brand doesn't mean that they don't have feelings for their ex, that they don't have what we call previous brand nostalgia. In studies across categories, we have found that when a loyal consumer moves away from a brand for a reason such as a change in the brand, which they found dislikable, they have always kept an eye out on that previous brand to understand if the brand is changing back to what they left, and they have feelings for their ex. So reconciliation is always possible if the circumstances are right. Nostalgia is strong for anchor brands, but not necessarily strong in change categories. So therefore, the process of change is complicated, right? So there's a huge number of steps and confusions within this that you find. So the process would vary according to whether the brand is an anchor or a change category. Now, how does this affect us in research? Now, a lot of the research we do is about measuring or predicting the impact of change. And very often when we do our concept researches, we tend to give the consumer the new idea, and try and get the response in a very short period of time. Sometimes we don't even give them the full story, we give them fragments. For instance, in the Coke example, Coke did do a product test before they launched their new formulation, but they did not tell the consumers that they were going to replace their old brand with this completely. Always the consumer believes that they have a choice, so it's important to give them the full story. So the point is that we rarely contextualize the response to change against the nature of the emotional relationship with the brand. And very often when we define loyalty, we have a behavioral definition of loyalty. Like we say, loyal to the brand, frequently used in the past 6 months or frequently used in the past 1 year. But we don't define it in the emotional sense. So the question is, do we understand the emotional nuances under loyalty which drive the response to change? And do we understand what the emotional impact of having to let go is to embrace the new, let go of what is familiar and comfortable? We are in a stage where we focus a lot on innovation, but the question is, does the consumer really want that innovation, and how do they deal with it? So therefore, there is a case for us to have a more holistic approach to researching change. The very first step is to understand the emotional relationship with the brand and define it in those terms. Understand if your brand is an anchor brand or in an anchor category, or is it a change brand in a change category. We need to understand even within the brand what are the anchor and change elements within that brand. Thereafter, having understood this context, then we should expose consumers to change, possibly with the deprivation of current product, because they need to know that this new change is going to replace their current reality, and then understand what the response is. It may be important for us to trace the response to change over a minimum relevant period, because as we understood that, the response to change is a process. The very first response is a pushback, and then thereafter there's a rationalization, then they might make up their minds. So we may not be giving them enough time to process the change, which we should. And finally, since consumers believe that they are the real owners of the brands to which they are loyal, it may be interesting for us to have consumer advisory panels for a longer term engagement, where we can bounce off every change that we are thinking of bringing about in the brand with this advisory panel and take their feedback before the change is actually planned. So this will help us to keep brands dynamic and evolving without breaking the bond with loyal consumers. Today, this is an issue that a lot of companies face when they have a huge loyal base, especially in categories which are anchor categories. How do you keep the brand evolving? How do you keep the brand dynamic without affecting the bond that you have with loyal consumers? So I'd like to conclude by saying that change is never easy. You fight to hold on, you fight to let go. And therefore, for us to understand how change affects us, we need to figure out a much more holistic approach to researching change. Thank you very much.